This video is about one of the most interesting lenses that came out recently, Blazar Apex 50mm. And what makes it so interesting is the fact that just a few months ago, lenses like this simply didn't exist. It's a budget anamorphic autofocus lens, which shouldn't really even make any sense. Not that long ago, budget anamorphic lenses were either this really weird contraptions of separate anamorphic lens group and actual focusing lens, or budget was probably about $10,000 or so. These days you can quite easily get really interesting anamorphics for about $1,000, maybe $1,500. But the fact that this one also has autofocus is something really special, because until recently there was no such thing. Now we have actually two options, not only Blazar Apex but also new series lenses. And one thing that I think is really important to remember throughout this initial thoughts video is the fact that these lenses are a complete new breed. There was nothing like this before. There are still some issues. Autofocus certainly doesn't perform as well as, let's say, Sony G Master lenses. Just the fact that lenses like this exist now and are also quite affordable is pretty cool, especially considering that things like autofocus can be actually updated over time. There are software updates being released pretty regularly, so the performance will improve even of the existing line of lenses, let alone any future models. And I think it will open a whole new way of creating videos which in the past you probably would never consider using anamorphics for. So here is the lens. It's quite chunky and a little bit heavy, nothing too bad, certainly not by anamorphic standards, but there is some heft to it. In comparison to something like, let's say, Sony 24 to 50mm 2.8, well, you can see that it's quite a bit bigger, but small enough that you can easily use it all day long. I'm not a huge fan of the color scheme of this lens, to be honest. I know it's a small thing that doesn't have any impact on performance, but personally I think it's a little bit too in your face. This sort of silver and black, fine, but this big orange ring, while I like the fact that it's actually matching orange on lens mount on Sony cameras, I think it's a bit much. And then there's also this blue seal. So yeah, there's a lot going on. Personally, I just prefer my lenses to be black, maybe with a touch of color, but I mean, it's all right. Build quality is really, really good. It's solid. I think it's either completely metal or mainly metal construction. Everything is really, really well put together. Focusing ring and aperture ring move really smooth. There is weather sealing. There is also USB-C port here, close to the mount, or on the mount. And that's for the software updates I mentioned earlier. Overall, really nice lens. Couple of things I'm not a huge fan of, other than the color scheme. The AF-MF switch seems to be the other way around than in pretty much any other lens I ever used. So AF is towards the camera. Not a big thing, but a bit odd in my opinion. Personally, I would prefer some sort of a lock on the aperture ring as well. It is quite recessed, and when you mount the lens and it's on the camera, it's quite difficult to move it, so it's not a big problem, but still, it's possible to move it, and I would prefer that it was lockable. This is Sony E-mount version. That's currently the only mount available, but there will be also versions for Nikon Z mount, Canon R, I believe, L mount, and so on. So it will be interesting to see actually if there are any difference in the design, like for example, if this orange ring changes to different color for different mounts. But yeah, at the moment just E-mount. This 50mm is the first one in this Apex line of lenses. 35 will be out very soon. I mean, there are already some tests available, but I don't think you can buy it just yet. And I'm assuming that there will be more lenses coming, probably something like 24, 85, and so on. So once again, this is very much the first one of its kind. The only really other comparable lens is one of the series lenses, which is also autofocus anamorphic. Other than that, there isn't really anything else out there like it. A couple of other important things to note is that technically it's super 35mm lens, so approximately 1.5 times crop, but I will come back to that later. And also it has 1.33 times squeeze. So if you are new to anamorphics, I don't really want to get into too much detail. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments, and I will send you some links to really good videos explaining much more about anamorphics, because we could talk about it for hours. But basically 1.33, it's, I would say, somewhat unusual format for anamorphic lenses, or maybe not so much unusual, but not very popular, as in you don't get that much of a horizontal stretch with 1.33, and also generally you don't get that much character from this lens. The standard squeeze ratio for anamorphic lenses is 2 times. So basically for 50mm lens, you have horizontal field of view of 25mm lens, right? You just divide 50 by 2. 1.5 is also really popular, so that would give you probably more like 32mm lens, something like that. 1.33 is closer to, I think, roughly 40mm. Sorry if my math isn't very accurate, but this is just to give you some rough idea. So basically, you're not really getting that much wider image. And also, when it comes to anamorphic lenses, there are basically 3 reasons why you may want to use them over spherical lenses. First of all, well, you can squeeze wider scene onto your sensor or in the passing film. Second thing is the character of those lenses, and I'll come back to that later, but basically anamorphic lenses tend to look very different than spherical lenses, or at least some of them do. And third, well, anamorphic lens flares, which you may like or not, but reality is that a lot of us are used to those blue streaks across the frame, which were kind of the trademark of anamorphic lenses from 70s and 80s. And until now, if you got 1.33 anamorphic lens, you wouldn't really get that much character out of it. This lens is very different, and hopefully you can see it in the B-roll that there is something about the look. You may not necessarily like it. A lot of people would call it imperfections, or would even say that, oh, this is a cheap lens and basically it just doesn't perform as well as it should. But I would disagree with that. What you see here is a lot of barrel distortion, a lot of vignetting, and some weird stuff happening at the edges. And sure, generally, you would think of those things as imperfection when it comes to lenses. But there are actually a lot of examples, even in really big productions, where this look is still visible. Those characteristics of lenses are still visible, even though the lenses themselves used on those productions cost $10,000 or tens of thousands of dollars each. If you watch something like, let's say, Shogun or Anora, very recent example, look at some of those scenes and you can see how much distortion there is towards the edges of the frame, or how much vignetting you get. And well, no one can say that those productions didn't have budget for good lenses. I know that Anora was shot on a relatively small budget, but still they used, I believe, Atlas Orion lenses, and those go for about 10 grand each. Shogun, I don't remember from the top of my head what lenses they used, but they are stupidly expensive, tens of thousands of dollars. So the way I see it is that whether you like those imperfections or not, that's just a personal preference. And a lens like this is just simply another tool in your toolbox, right? If I want perfect clean look, I'll just use one of Sony GM lenses. If I want a bit more character, but still overall nice clean look, I may use Cine spherical lens such as DZ-8 Vespeed Primes, for example, and many other options. I mean, there are tons of them. But if I want something more, then a lens like this is absolutely perfect. One of my favorite lenses of all time when it comes to photography was Canon 50mm 1.2, not the current RF version, but the previous one, the EF mount one. It was just such a beautiful lens, but it certainly wasn't the sharpest. It had a lot of vignetting, edges were very, very soft. The center was sharp, but this lens was actually designed to be slightly soft or have softer edges to have this beautiful creamy bokeh. And I really appreciate it. On paper, the lens didn't really make much sense, but when I saw the images it can produce, I bought one pretty much the same day because it just worked. So of course I would not use a lens like this all the time, but when I want to get that look with a bit more character, I think the image it produces is absolutely stunning. Now, about the sensor coverage of this lens and field of view. It is 50mm and it is designed for, or officially designed for super 35mm sensors, so approximately 1.5 times crop. I've been using it on Sony a7 IV vast majority of the time, and in 4K mode it has crop of I think roughly 1.3. And while I can see some vignetting around the edges, and you can see some examples of that now, you're certainly pushing the limits of what this lens can do, but you can still use it. And what's really important here is considering what kind of aspect ratio you want for the final delivery. Very popular aspect ratio for anamorphic lenses is 2.39 to 1, so that gives you this widescreen look. Personally, I don't really use it, or at least not at the moment. I started using 2 to 1 aspect ratio, so a little bit wider than 16:9. And I think for that, this lens is absolutely perfect, because basically you can crop out enough of the distortion and, more importantly, the vignetting around the edges, and you still get image that's wide enough that you get a lot of that character. Okay, so here you can see this lens on Sony a7S III, so full frame sensor, and you can see the image cropped to different aspect ratios. So 239:1, you can see what's happening around the edges, and also 2 to 1. So that gives you some sort of an idea of how this lens performs when you push it essentially beyond that Super 35 format, which it was designed to work with. I'm not sure how in focus I am while talking now to this camera, because the screen is unfortunately too far away, but I'm using now face tracking and autofocus in this lens. So if I'm perfectly in focus, that gives you an idea of how it performs, how the lens performs in conditions like this. What's important to mention is that it's performing much better, from what I heard and from what I've seen in other videos or heard from other people. It performs much better with the latest generation of Sony cameras. So something like a7C II or whatever other cameras have their latest AI autofocus. I have a7S III and a7 IV here, and of course these cameras have older autofocus system, so the performance is not as good, but in my opinion is still acceptable. To test autofocus a bit more, I used it on one of my recent hikes. Conditions weren't really great. You can see the video by following the link in the description, or I'll try to put the link somewhere up there. It's not the most exciting video, especially to show off the anamorphic look or character of this lens. The weather wasn't great, and well, you will see in the video that it's not the best example, but it gives you an idea of how well autofocus performs in a situation like this. All of it was shot with autofocus. There are a couple of moments where you will see that it's not performing perfectly, but most of the time I think it's acceptable. It's actually pretty decent. The first part of that video, when I'm actually using the lens, it's only about 40 seconds long or something like that, certainly less than a minute. So if you're interested, I recommend you watch it. You don't have to watch the second part of it, but it gives you some sort of an idea what you can expect from this lens. And this actually brings me to probably the most interesting aspect of it. I took an anamorphic lens on a hike on just my Sony a7 IV, and something like this wouldn't really be, maybe not possible, but not very feasible a few months ago, let alone a couple of years ago. Anamorphic lenses tend to be big, heavy, and manual focus only. And also, if you have 1.5 or let alone 2 times squeeze ratio, using your camera monitor is making it pretty much impossible to see what you are actually shooting, or if what you are shooting is in focus. So if you want to take a rig like this anywhere and shoot with it, well, you need external monitor, you need your camera obviously, and then you need pretty bulky lens. A lot of them also will require PL2E or whatever other mount adapter. So that's quite a lot of camera gear. Then you probably need some additional batteries, either for the monitor or you need a V-mount battery or something like that. And if you're planning to carry this rig with you on, let's say, hike somewhere in the mountains, I mean, I tend to wear my camera on Peak Design clip on my backpack strap. Well, I wouldn't be able to hang all of that here, right? Now, sure, if I'm heading out with the sole purpose of making a video or film or whatever, then that's absolutely fine. But often the videos I shoot are maybe not a byproduct of hiking, but essentially there are two elements to what I do, right? One is I'm going on a hike. Second, I document it. And carrying all this stuff very often wouldn't be feasible, not even in terms of weight, but just the bulk of it, all the stuff sticking out if you need to scramble or something like that. It's getting a bit sketchy. So being able to just have literally a camera and a lens and that's it, it's a total game changer. And the fact that it has autofocus also adds that whole additional layer of functionality. And of course, no anamorphic lens review would be complete without showing what kind of lens flares that lens can produce. And this one is pretty epic. Just check this out. So you get those really nice long streaks. You also get those vertical ones, and you get those secondary flare as well. This lens only comes in silver flare version, so basically the color of the flare depends on the color of the light source. As you can see here at sunset, it was much more yellow. A lot of old anamorphic lenses would produce blue streaks regardless of the light source color. It's a shame that you cannot get a blue streak version, but hey, it is what it is. And yeah, I think it's pretty cool. So I think that's pretty much it. I didn't really want it to be like a traditional review with a lot of test shots and so on. If you're interested in something like this, let me know and I can put something together, maybe tests on different cameras, on full frame, Super 35 and Sony a7 IV, so 1.3 times crop or something like that, different aspect ratios and so on. But I think hopefully the footage I showed you here gives you a pretty good idea of what this lens, what kind of image this lens produces, and also what you can expect from it. These are still early days for me with this lens, and I don't have huge amount of experience shooting with anamorphics overall, but so far, as I said earlier, I really enjoy it. I enjoy the fact that I can take this lens with me on shoots where normally I wouldn't consider anamorphics. And when the 35mm version will come out, I think that will be even more useful because that focal length will be much more practical for the type of content I shoot. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that one. And finally, I think this lens is absolutely perfect for anyone who wants to get into anamorphics but doesn't want the steep learning curve or a lot of adjustment that comes with using something like, let's say, 2x anamorphic PL mount lens with manual focus. If you just want to get started with lenses like this, get that different look, different character, those really unique lens flares, but you don't want all the hassle with building completely different rig, then I think this is a perfect option. Basically, if you want still to be able to just shoot in a typical run and gun scenario, just pick up your camera lens, that's it. You don't have to worry about anything else. I think this is absolutely spot on. I think that's it for this one. If you have any questions about this lens or any suggestions or any requests what you would like to see in the future, please let me know in the comments. If possible, I'll try to include those in future videos. And other than that, thank you for watching and see you next time. Bye.